by thinking that it's something that created the universe, that maybe the universe itself is this living thing. The universe itself is God.
Well, that's an absolutely great question. There are three basic views about this. One is that the universe is itself, the physical universe, is eternal and self-existent. And some people think of it as a kind of organism. There was this Gaia hypothesis that Lynn Margulis. Most standard materialists just think of it as the product of matter and eternally existent or self-existent matter and energy, or the physical fields that are expressed in material particles. They think of those as eternal and self-existent. The other view is a more pantheistic view, that there is a kind of God, but it's not an agent or a conscious mind that to whom you could pray or with whom you could communicate, or who has communicated or created, but rather it sort of pervades the physical universe, and it is also eternal and self-existent. And then the third view is that there is a transcendent creator beyond the universe who brought the physical universe into existence.
And who brought him into existence, or her, or it, or they?
Just to finish the other thought, and then I'll come back to that.
Yeah.
The third view is the view that I hold. I'm a classical theist, and I think the scientific evidence is pointing in that direction fairly strongly, in part because we now have evidence from multiple lines of evidence suggesting that the universe did in fact have a beginning. The material universe does not look to have been eternal and self-existent. And so then, to answer your second question, I would say that every philosophical system, sometimes philosophers talk about worldviews, whether they're formal philosophical systems or just sort of the informal set of assumptions that we all need to make about reality. But every worldview needs to answer the question, what is the thing or the process or the entity from which everything else came? What's the ground of being, the starting point? And up until the 20th century, I think the materialist naturalist view was very credible because it affirmed that matter and energy were eternal and self-existent in the same way that theists thought God was eternal and self-existent. But in both systems, or in all systems, something is what philosophers call the primitive, the thing from which everything else comes. I think as a consequence, or in the wake of our modern cosmological, astrophysical discoveries that the material universe itself had a beginning, that matter and energy is now a poor candidate to be that eternal self-existent thing. And therefore, I think that the theistic view that a transcendent creator is the thing from which everything else came, without itself being created, is the best place to start our philosophical thinking. It provides the best explanation for what we see.
When you say that there's direct evidence that the universe has a beginning, what do you mean by that?
Well, it's a fascinating story, and when I tell in the new book, Return of the God Hypothesis, there are basically three different lines of evidence. There's three different classes of evidence, if you will. There's the evidence from observational astronomy. Maybe we should just start there, and then I'll tell you about the stuff from theoretical physics. Before I'm sorry, they keep flopping off my head.
Sorry, you can adjust them. They push in.
Yeah. Oh, good. There we go.
Brian Simpson was here. He's got a big head.
Okay, that's awesome. Well, it's an unbelievable. It's another one of these. And I think maybe part of my story is that I was always fascinated with these issues at the intersection of science and philosophy, where the scientific evidence leads you to a big philosophical question or possibly conclusion. So back to the ancient Greeks, we've had this debate. Is the universe eternal and self-existent? Has it always been here? Or is it finite? Did it come into existence at a point in time? In which case, was there possibly an external creator that brought it into existence? In the 1920s, we get the first scientific evidence that helps us to answer that question. Coming into the 20th century, most physicists assume that the universe is eternal. It's infinite. It's past eternal. You can go back as far as you want. And there's always matter. There's always energy. There's always space. There's always time. In the 1920s, Edwin Hubble is at Mount Wilson in Southern California, the big observatory there. He's a lawyer who's come into astronomy at a very propitious time because the astronomers have just started building these great dome telescopes. And they've also been developing photographic technology that allows them to collect a lot more light over a long period of time. And he starts looking at the distant galaxies. No, actually, well, they were nebula. They didn't know whether they were galaxies or not. And there was a debate right up to 1920 whether or not the Milky Way in which we live is the only galaxy, or whether these little smudges that they were detecting on the photographic plates, with a little dot of light with smudges, whether those were other galaxies or just a star with gas around it. And Hubble was able to use some new techniques for measuring distances to distant astronomical objects, in particular to these nebula. And he found that the distance to the Andromeda Nebula was measured at 900,000 light years, but the accepted measurement for the distance across the Milky Way was only 300,000 light years. So clearly the Milky Way could not contain the Andromeda Nebula, so therefore the Andromeda Nebula wasn't just a nebula, it was another galaxy. And in the ensuing years then, as he uses the big telescopes and these new techniques, he establishes that there are galaxies galore, spiral galaxies, spindle nebula galaxies. So we now know, I think I put in the book, I used the number 200 billion galaxies. I think I've been since corrected that it's another order of magnitude, that astronomers now think there's 2 trillion galaxies in the observable universe. It's just unbelievable how much our awareness of the vastness of the universe has expanded in really 100 years. It's amazing.
Right.
But the second thing that Hubble discovered is the light coming from those distant galaxies is being stretched out. If you shine light through a prism, it separates into the colors red to violet. And the red light, it corresponds to light with longer wavelengths. And what he's detecting is light that has shifted in these spectral analyses that they do in the red direction, suggesting that its wavelengths are longer, as you would expect if those galactic objects are receding away from us, if they're moving away. So it's like the Doppler effect with the train whistle. If the train's moving away, the pitch of the sound goes down. And that's because the sound waves are being stretched out. Well, the same thing happens with light.